At our wedding, my mother-in-law announced she was giving her apartment to her son only, so that a hillbilly peasant like me wouldn't get a share. Everyone was stunned. My dad got up and said, "Mile marker 47, route 15. When my mother-in-law heard it, her face went pale. The crystal chandeliers of Rosemary's fine dining cast elegant shadows across the intimate reception hall, where two worlds had collided in celebration of love. Round tables draped in ivory linens held arrangements of white roses and baby's breath, while soft jazz played from hidden speakers. The restaurant's mahogany walls and gold accents spoke of old money and refined taste, exactly the kind of venue Sandra Morrison had insisted upon for her son's wedding. At the head table, newlyweds Kyrie and Joshua sat side by side, their hands intertwined despite the tension that had been building throughout the evening. Joshua, resplendent in his tailored tuxedo, carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his smile, though genuine when he looked at his bride, seemed strained when his gaze wandered to the divided reception hall. Kyrie radiated quiet beauty in her simple but elegant wedding dress. She had chosen it carefully from a boutique sale, spending weeks searching for something that would fit both her budget and the upscale venue. Her auburn hair was swept into a graceful updo, adorned with a single pearl clip that had belonged to her grandmother. Despite the grandeur surrounding her, she maintained her natural warmth, greeting each guest with genuine appreciation. The guests themselves told the story of two different Americas. On Joshua's side, the tables were filled with business associates, country club members, and family friends who wore their wealth like well-tailored suits. The women's jewelry caught the light as they gestured with manicured hands, discussing their latest vacations to Europe or their children's Ivy League educations. The men spoke in measured tones about market trends and investment opportunities, their conversations peppered with the casual mentions of second homes and yacht clubs. Kyrie's side of the reception painted a different picture entirely. Her relatives and friends had dressed in their finest clothes, suits that had been purchased for special occasions, and dresses that had been carefully selected and altered to fit perfectly. They laughed more freely, their conversations warmer and more animated. Her cousin Maria had brought her famous homemade cookies as a surprise for the dessert table, despite the restaurant's elaborate cake display. Her Uncle Frank, a machinist with calloused hands, had given a heartfelt speech during the ceremony about how love was the only currency that truly mattered. At the center of Kyrie's table sat Bob Williams, her father, a man whose presence commanded quiet respect despite his humble occupation. As a long-haul truck driver, Bob had spent decades crossing the country, his weathered hands gripping steering wheels and his eyes scanning endless highways. He wore his best suit, a navy blue ensemble he'd purchased specifically for his daughter's wedding, and his silver hair was neatly combed back. What struck everyone who met Bob was his unwavering dignity. He didn't fidget with his tie or seem intimidated by the opulent surroundings. Instead, he sat with his shoulders back and his head held high, engaging in easy conversation with anyone who approached him. Bob had worked hard for years to put Kyrie through college, never once complaining about the sacrifice. He had taught her that a person's worth wasn't measured by their bank account, but by their character and their willingness to work hard for what they believed in. Tonight, watching his daughter marry the man she loved, he felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the expensive venue or the prominent guests. Across the room, Sandra Morrison surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of a woman accustomed to measuring everything and everyone against her own exacting standards. At 55, she was impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect chignon, and her makeup was flawless, applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearances were everything in her world. Sandra had built her commercial real estate empire from the ground up, starting as a secretary and clawing her way to the top through sheer determination and ruthless business acumen. She believed deeply that everything in life had to be earned, that success was a reward for those strong enough to seize it. This philosophy had served her well in business, but it had also hardened her heart in ways she refused to acknowledge. From the moment Joshua had introduced Kyrie to his family, Sandra had been skeptical. Here was a girl who worked as a nurse at a public hospital, who drove a modest sedan, who lived in a small apartment and shopped at discount stores. What could she possibly offer her son beyond her pretty face and sweet demeanor? Sandra had hoped it was merely a phase, that Joshua would eventually come to his senses and find someone more suitable, someone from their social circle who understood the responsibilities that came with wealth and status. But as the months passed and Joshua's commitment to Kyrie only deepened, Sandra's skepticism had curdled into something more bitter. She watched the way her son looked at this working-class girl with genuine adoration, and it galled her. Kyrie hadn't earned Joshua's love through achievement or social climbing. She had simply been lucky enough to catch his eye at a charity fundraiser where she had been volunteering. In Sandra's mind, this made their entire relationship somehow illegitimate. As the evening progressed, Sandra's disapproval became increasingly difficult to mask. She watched Bob Williams charm their wealthy guests with his humble wisdom and straightforward manner, and it only fueled her resentment. She observed Kyrie's genuine gratitude for the elaborate wedding Sandra had ultimately paid for, and saw it as confirmation of the girl's lower status rather than evidence of her good character. When the time came for toasts, Sandra rose from her seat with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The soft murmur of conversation gradually died as guests turned to face her. She held her crystal champagne flute aloft, her smile sharp and calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the reception hall, "I would like to propose a toast to the happy couple and to share some wonderful news." Joshua felt a flutter of unease in his stomach. He knew his mother well enough to recognize the particular gleam in her eye that preceded her most cutting remarks. Beside him, Kyrie squeezed his hand gently, sensing his tension. "As a wedding gift," Sandra continued, her tone becoming more pointed, "I am pleased to announce that I will be giving my downtown apartment to my son Joshua. It's a beautiful property, worth considerable value, and I believe it will serve him well as he begins this new chapter of his life." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. The apartment Sandra referenced was a stunning penthouse in the city's most exclusive district, worth well over $1 million. It was the kind of gift that spoke to serious wealth and generosity. But Sandra wasn't finished. Her smile grew colder as she delivered the blade hidden within her supposed generosity. "Of course," she added, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "This gift is for Joshua alone. I believe in earning one's place in this world, and I think it's important that this poor peasant learns to make her own way rather than simply benefiting from fortunate circumstances." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of someone setting down their champagne glass too hard. Guests looked around uncomfortably, unsure whether they had heard correctly or how to respond to such a blatant insult. Joshua's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he struggled to process what his mother had just said. The shame that washed over him was almost physical in its intensity. He should defend his wife, should stand up to his mother's cruelty, but the words seemed trapped in his throat. Kyrie sat frozen, her champagne glass trembling slightly in her hand. The humiliation was complete and public, designed to remind her and everyone present exactly where Sandra believed she belonged. Yet even in this moment of devastating embarrassment, Kyrie maintained her composure. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes meeting Sandra's with quiet dignity, refusing to give the older woman the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. At his table, Bob Williams had gone very still, his weathered hands resting calmly on the white tablecloth. His eyes had sharpened, taking in his daughter's pain and his new son-in-law's paralysis, with the measured assessment of a man who had faced down aggressive drivers and dangerous weather conditions for decades. The silence that followed Sandra's cruel toast seemed to stretch endlessly, thick with tension and the collective discomfort of 50 wedding guests who had witnessed something far beyond mere rudeness. Some stared at their plates, others exchanged meaningful glances, but no one seemed to know how to respond to such calculated cruelty. Then, slowly, deliberately, Bob Williams pushed back his chair. The scraping sound against the polished floor seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed reception hall. He rose to his full height, not particularly tall, but somehow commanding in his quiet dignity. His weathered hands, steady despite the charged atmosphere, reached for the microphone that had been passed around for toasts earlier in the evening. The guests turned toward him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Some of Joshua's wealthy relatives probably expected an emotional outburst, perhaps some working-class indignation that would only serve to prove Sandra's point about the cultural divide. Others, particularly those who had spoken with Bob during the cocktail hour, sensed something different in his measured movements. Kyrie looked up at her father with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She knew that look in his eyes, the same focused intensity he'd shown when confronting her high school principal about unfair treatment or when dealing with difficult customers at the trucking company. It was the look of a man who had made a decision and would not be deterred from his course. Bob's fingers wrapped around the microphone. He didn't fidget or show any sign of nervousness. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the reception hall before finally settling on Sandra Morrison. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and measured. It carried the authority of a man who had spent decades navigating dangerous highways and dealing with all manner of people. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger or emotion. He simply looked directly at Sandra and spoke 9 words that seemed to hang in the air like a pronouncement. Mile marker 47, Route 15, March 15th, 1995. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sandra's face drained of all colour, the champagne flute slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers to shatter against the floor. The sound of breaking crystal seemed to echo through the stunned silence as she stared at Bob with an expression of absolute shock. Around the room, guests exchanged confused glances. The specificity of the reference, the precise location, the exact date, clearly meant something significant. But to everyone except Sandra, it was nothing more than a cryptic collection of numbers and a road designation. Some of Joshua's business associates frowned, trying to make sense of what sounded like directions to nowhere in particular. Kyrie's relatives looked equally puzzled, though they could see that whatever Bob had said had struck Sandra like a physical blow. Joshua looked between his mother and his father-in-law with growing bewilderment. He had never seen his mother look so shaken, so completely stripped of her usual commanding presence. Her carefully applied makeup seemed to have aged her 10 years in a matter of seconds, and her hands were trembling as she gripped the edge of the table for support. Sandra's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. She was staring at Bob with an expression that had transformed from shock to something approaching recognition, and with it, a dawning horror that seemed to grow with each passing second. March 15th, 1995. The rain hammered against the windshield of Sandra's car with a fury that seemed almost personal. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white as she navigated the winding stretch of Route 15 through the darkness. At 8.5 months pregnant, she should have been home, safe and warm. But she was on the road, in the middle of a looming storm. The contractions had started 20 minutes ago, mild at first, easily dismissed as the Braxton Hicks pains her doctor had warned her about. But they were getting stronger, more regular, and Sandra was beginning to admit to herself that this might be the real thing. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks, but babies, she was learning, followed their own schedules. Lightning illuminated the empty highway ahead, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. The storm had blown in from nowhere, transforming what should have been a routine drive home into something treacherous. Sandra squinted through the rain, looking for mile markers, trying to calculate how much farther she had to drive to reach the hospital. That's when she heard it. A grinding sound from beneath the hood, followed by a series of mechanical coughs that every driver dreads. The engine shuddered once, twice, and then died completely. Sandra managed to coast to the shoulder of the road, her heart pounding as she realized the full scope of her predicament. She was alone, in labor, in the middle of a storm, with no cell phone coverage and no way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and in this weather, it could be hours before another car came along. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Sandra doubled over in pain, her breathing coming in short gasps. Through the rain-streaked passenger window, she saw headlights approaching, the distinctive high beams of a large truck. Sandra had never been so grateful to see another vehicle in her life. She managed to turn on her hazard lights and wave frantically as the truck began to slow down. The 18-wheeler pulled over ahead of her car, its air brakes hissing in the storm. A man in a worn denim jacket and baseball cap jogged through the rain toward her vehicle, his face barely visible in the darkness. When he reached her window, Sandra rolled it down just enough to speak. "Ma'am, are you all right?" His voice was kind, concerned, with the slight drawl of someone who had grown up in rural America. "I'm in labor," Sandra gasped, another contraction hitting as she spoke. "My car broke down and I need to get to the hospital. Please." The truck driver didn't hesitate. "I'll get you there, Mom. Don't you worry about a thing." He helped her from the car to his truck, supporting her weight as she climbed into the cab. The interior was clean and warm, with a thermos of coffee and a CB radio crackling with distant voices. As he pulled back onto the highway, Sandra caught a glimpse of the mile marker in his headlights. 47. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of pain and gratitude. The truck driver, she never even learned his name, spoke to her in soothing tones, telling her everything would be fine, that they'd make it in time. He radioed ahead to dispatch, who called the hospital to alert them that they were coming. When they arrived at the emergency entrance, he helped her out of the truck and stayed until the medical staff had her safely inside. Sandra turned to thank him, to ask his name, but he was already walking back to his truck, disappearing into the storm as quickly as he had appeared. 2 hours later, Joshua was born, healthy, safe, and completely unaware of how close he had come to arriving on the side of a dark highway in the middle of a thunderstorm. The weight of recognition settled over Sandra like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its completeness. The man standing before her, this truck driver she had dismissed as beneath her notice, the father of the girl she had just publicly humiliated, was the same person who had saved her life and Joshua's on that terrible night 29 years ago. The irony was so brutal it felt like a physical blow. Sandra sank back into her chair, her legs no longer able to support her. The elegant reception hall seemed to spin around her as the full magnitude of her mistake crashed over her in waves. She had spent years building walls between herself and people like Bob Williams, convincing herself that her wealth and status made her superior to the working class. Yet, it was one of these very people who had been there in her moment of greatest need, asking for nothing in return. Bob Williams had not only saved her life, he had saved Joshua's life too. The son she loved so fiercely, the boy she had raised to believe that everything worthwhile had to be earned, existed only because a truck driver had shown kindness to a stranger on a dark highway. And now she had repaid that kindness by insulting his daughter on what should have been the happiest day of the young woman's life. Bob remained standing, the microphone still in his hand, but he offered no further explanation. His message was crystal clear to the one person who needed to understand it. He didn't need to elaborate on the connection, didn't need to remind Sandra of the debt she owed him. The simple recitation of that date and location was enough to strip away years of carefully constructed superiority and reveal the truth beneath. The other guests sat in confused silence, sensing that something monumentally significant had just occurred, but unable to grasp its meaning. The tension in the room had shifted from the aftermath of Sandra's cruel toast to something far more complex and uncomfortable. They could see Sandra's complete breakdown, could witness Bob's quiet dignity, but the context remained maddeningly elusive. Joshua looked back and forth between his mother and his father-in-law with growing bewilderment. He had never seen his mother look so shaken, so completely stripped of her usual commanding presence. Carrie herself sat frozen, her hands still in Joshua's, watching her father with a mixture of pride and confusion. She had never seen him take command of a room quite like this, had never witnessed him render someone as powerful as Sandra Morrison completely speechless with just a few words. Whatever those words meant, they had transformed the entire dynamic of the reception in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Bob Williams stood in the center of the reception hall, the microphone steady in his weathered hands. He took a moment to survey the room, his gaze moving slowly across the faces of the wealthy and working class alike, before he began to speak in that same calm, measured tone that had carried him through decades of long-haul trucking. "I've worked hard all my life," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the elegant dining room. 35 years behind the wheel of a truck, crossing this country from coast to coast, earning my money in a fair and honest way. I've never asked for handouts, never expected something for nothing, and I've never looked down on anyone for the work they do or the circumstances they were born into. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. Some of Joshua's relatives shifted uncomfortably, perhaps hearing an implicit criticism in his simple statement of values. "My dreams were never complicated," Bob continued. "I didn't dream of penthouses or country clubs or fancy cars. I dreamed of simple things, steady work that would put food on the table, a roof over my family's head, and the chance to raise my daughter in a world where she could be proud of who she was and where she came from." His voice grew softer, more personal. "When my wife Mary passed away 5 years ago, I thought my world had ended. She was my partner in everything, my best friend, the woman who made our little house feel like a palace. After she was gone, I'll be honest with you, I didn't see much point in getting up each morning." Kyrie's eyes filled with tears as she watched her father. She had seen him struggle through those dark months after her mother's death, had watched him slowly rebuild his life around his love for her and his work. "But I had one thing left that gave my life meaning," Bob said, his gaze finding his daughter's face. "I had Kyrie, my beautiful, kind, intelligent daughter who became a nurse because she wanted to help people, who volunteers at the free clinic on weekends, who has never met a stranger she couldn't find something good in. She became the center of my world, and I made myself a promise that I would do everything in my power to make sure she was happy." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small framed photograph, holding it up for the room to see. It showed a modest but well-maintained 2-story house with a wraparound porch, flower boxes under the windows, and a white picket fence surrounding a neat yard. "When Kyrie told me she had found a man she wanted to marry, I knew exactly what I wanted to give them as a wedding gift," Bob said, his voice warming with pride. "This house. I built it with my own hands over the course of 3 years, every board and nail placed with love. I built it for Mary and me, but we were only blessed to live in it together for 2 years before she passed." The room was completely silent now, even the soft jazz music seeming to fade away as everyone focused on Bob's words. "I've been fixing it up these past few months, getting it ready for Kyrie and Joshua to start their life together. It's got 4 bedrooms, a big kitchen where families can gather, and a yard where children can play safely. It's not worth millions of dollars, but it's worth something more valuable than money. It's worth the love and sweat and dreams that went into building it." Bob looked around the room again, his expression growing more serious. You see, material things stopped being important to me a long time ago. What matters is family, love, respect, and the legacy we leave behind. My daughter and I, we're not the type of people who can be bought or intimidated or made to feel ashamed of who we are. We're not like that. His gaze swept across the wealthy guests, and for the first time, some of them had the grace to look uncomfortable. Ever since I arrived here tonight, I felt some of you looking at me like I was somehow less than you. Like my work clothes and my calloused hands meant I didn't belong in this fancy restaurant. Like the fact that I drive a truck for a living made me inferior to people who've never had to work with their hands. Bob's smile was gentle but pointed. I've seen that look before, and it doesn't bother me anymore. I know who I am, and I know what I'm worth. But when someone directs that same contempt at my daughter, when someone calls her a poor peasant who doesn't deserve to be happy, well, that's when I have to speak up. He turned slowly to face Sandra, who sat frozen in her chair, her face still pale with shock. The recognition in her eyes was unmistakable now, and Bob's next words confirmed what she had been desperately hoping wasn't true. You see, Mrs. Morrison, unlike you, I recognized you the moment I walked into this room tonight. I could never forget those pleading eyes, that voice begging me to help you get to the hospital. I recognized you. And I remembered exactly what happened on March 15th, 1995, at mile marker 47 on Route 15. Sandra's hands began to tremble as Bob continued, his voice remaining calm and steady despite the bombshell he was dropping. I have to admit, I was curious about how fate had brought us together in such an unexpected way. The pregnant woman I helped that night, the one who was so scared and grateful, had somehow become the mother of the man my daughter loved. I thought it was beautiful, actually, like some kind of cosmic circle completing itself. Bob's expression grew more serious, though his tone remained measured. But I have to say, Mrs. Morrison, I was shocked by what you had become. The woman I helped that night was frightened, yes, but she was also humble, grateful, human. She understood that sometimes we all need help, that sometimes we're all at the mercy of circumstances beyond our control. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. I never would have imagined that the woman who once begged a truck driver to save her life would turn into someone who looks down on working people as if they're beneath her notice. Someone who would publicly humiliate a young woman on her wedding day simply because she comes from a different social class. Sandra's composure finally cracked, and tears began to stream down her face. But Bob wasn't finished. I want to make something very clear to you, Mrs. Morrison, and to anyone else in this room who might be confused about what just happened here, Bob said, his voice gaining strength. I didn't save your life that night because I expected anything in return. I didn't help you because I thought you owed me something. I helped you because that's what decent people do for each other when times get tough. He looked around the room one final time, his gaze settling on each table of guests. But I will not stand by and watch anyone, not you, not anyone else, belittle my daughter or make her feel like she's worth less than she is. Kyrie Williams is worth more than all the money in this room combined, and any man who gets to marry her should consider himself the luckiest person alive. Bob's final words were delivered directly to Sandra, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute moral certainty. So, whatever games you want to play with apartments and inheritances, Mrs. Morrison, you go right ahead. My daughter doesn't need your charity, and she doesn't need your approval. She has something much more valuable than anything you could give her. She has love, respect, and a family that will always stand behind her. The silence that followed Bob's speech was profound, broken only by the soft sound of tears falling. Kyrie stood frozen at the head table, her champagne glass forgotten in her trembling hand as emotions crashed over her in waves. The tears came slowly at first, then more freely as the full weight of her father's words settled into her heart. She cried for her mother, whose memory had been invoked so tenderly in her father's speech. She cried for her father, this man who had worked hard to put her through nursing school, who had never once complained about the sacrifices he made for her future. Watching him stand up to a room full of wealthy people with such quiet dignity, seeing him defend her honor when her own husband had failed to do so, filled her with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that was almost overwhelming. But perhaps most of all, she cried for the surprise gift that had been revealed in such an unexpected way. As the tears continued to fall, Kyrie became increasingly aware of the man sitting silently beside her. Joshua, her new husband, the man who had promised just hours ago to love and honor her, sat paralyzed in his chair. His face was pale, his hands clenched in his lap, but his mouth remained firmly closed. Even now, after witnessing his mother's cruel attack and his father-in-law's dignified response, he seemed unable to find his voice. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Joshua hadn't defended her, not when his mother had humiliated her in front of 50 guests on what should have been the happiest day of her life. He had sat there in stunned silence, seemingly more concerned about his mother's approval than his wife's dignity. Kyrie looked at Joshua through her tears, searching his face for some sign of the man she had fallen in love with. All she saw now was a boy who seemed more afraid of disappointing his mother than of losing his wife. The wedding reception, which had begun with such hope and promise, now felt like a battlefield where the lines had been drawn not between families, but between values. On one side stood her father, representing honor, dignity, and unconditional love. On the other side sat Sandra Morrison, representing wealth, status, and the kind of conditional affection that came with strings attached. And somewhere in the middle sat Joshua, apparently unable to choose which side he wanted to be on. The uncertainty of what would happen next weighed heavily on Kyrie's mind. How could she continue with a marriage that had been tainted by such cruelty? How could she build a life with a man who seemed unable to stand up for her when it mattered most? The beautiful house her father had built for them now seemed like a dream that might never be realized. After what felt like an eternity, Kyrie made her decision. She hesitated for only a moment, looking one last time at Joshua, giving him one final chance to speak up, to defend her, to show that he was the man she thought she had married. But Joshua remained silent, his gaze darting between his mother and his wife, as if he were trying to solve an impossible equation. Slowly, with the dignity she had inherited from her father, Kyrie stood up. Her wedding dress rustled softly as she moved, the expensive fabric that Sandra had insisted upon, now feeling like a costume she was eager to shed. She looked down at Joshua one more time, her eyes filled with disappointment and a sadness that seemed to age her beyond her years. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether she was apologizing to him or to herself wasn't clear. Joshua's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. He half rose from his chair, his hand reaching toward her, but then he glanced at his mother, who sat frozen in her own private hell of recognition and shame. Even in this moment, when his marriage was literally walking away from him, Joshua seemed unable to act without considering his mother's reaction. Carrie turned away from the head table and walked slowly toward her father. Bob Williams stood up to meet her, his weathered face creased with concern and love. He didn't say anything as she approached. He didn't need to. His presence was steady and reassuring, a lighthouse in the storm of emotions that had engulfed the reception. Together, father and daughter began to walk toward the exit of the elegant restaurant. Their steps were measured and dignified, not the frantic flight of people running from trouble, but the purposeful movement of individuals who had made a difficult but necessary choice. Kyrie's hand found her father's arm, and he covered it with his own, offering silent support. Behind them, Joshua finally found his voice. "Kyrie, wait," he called out, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood up. But then he stopped, his gaze once again darting to his mother, who sat staring at the table in front of her as if she could will herself to disappear. The indecision that had paralyzed him throughout the evening continued to hold him captive, and his plea died in his throat. The 50 wedding guests sat in stunned silence, witnessing the end of what should have been a celebration. Some looked confused, others embarrassed, and a few seemed to be beginning to understand the moral drama that had just played out before them. Sandra remained motionless, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears, her perfect composure finally and completely shattered. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. One of Kyrie's relatives, her Uncle Frank, the machinist with the calloused hands, had begun to applaud. The sound echoed through the silent reception hall, and gradually, like a wave building strength, other guests began to join in. The applause started with Kyrie's side of the room, the working-class friends and family who had watched one of their own face down wealth and privilege with quiet dignity. But it didn't stop there. Slowly, hesitantly, some of Joshua's guests began to clap as well. Perhaps they had been moved by Bob's speech, or perhaps they simply recognized courage when they saw it. The applause grew stronger, more sustained, until it filled the entire restaurant. It was the kind of applause that said more than words ever could. An acknowledgement of what they had all witnessed, a recognition of the values that had been defended, and perhaps most importantly, a statement about which side of the moral divide they chose to stand on. The wedding reception ended in shambles, the elegant tables abandoned with half-eaten meals and wilted flowers. The crystal chandeliers still cast their warm light over empty chairs and scattered napkins, but the celebration had died the moment Kyrie Williams walked out with her father. In the days that followed, Sandra discovered that her worst fears about social disgrace were coming true, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't Kyrie's working-class background that had made her a social pariah. It was her own behavior that had destroyed her carefully cultivated reputation. The story of the wedding spread through their affluent social circle like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Sandra's phone had stopped ringing. Her usual lunch companions at the country club suddenly had other commitments. The women who had once competed for invitations to her dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Even her business associates began keeping their distance, as if her moral bankruptcy might somehow be contagious. As the isolation deepened, Sandra began experiencing nightmares that left her gasping for air in the middle of the night. She would dream of that terrible storm, of her car breaking down on the dark highway, of the contractions that threatened to bring Joshua into the world on the side of the road. In her dreams, she was always alone, with no truck driver to save her, no kindness from strangers, no hope of rescue. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as she remembered the terror of that night. But now the dreams carried a different kind of horror, the realization of how far she had fallen from the woman who had once been grateful for a working man's compassion. Desperate to understand what had happened to her, Sandra began searching through old photo albums she hadn't looked at in years. In dusty boxes stored in her penthouse closet, she found pictures that told a story she had tried to forget. There she was at 22, wearing a second-hand dress at her college graduation, her parents beaming with pride beside her. Her father wore the same ill-fitting suit he had worn to church every Sunday, and her mother's hands showed the calluses of someone who had worked in a factory for 30 years. She found a photo of her first apartment, a tiny studio in a run-down building where she had lived on ramen noodles and determination. Another picture showed her at her first job, a secretary position at a small real estate firm, where she had worked overtime without pay just to prove herself worthy of advancement. The woman in these photographs was hungry, ambitious, but also humble. She knew what it meant to count every penny, to wear the same outfit to multiple job interviews, to smile gratefully when someone offered her a chance. That woman would never have called anyone a poor peasant, because she had been one herself. Sandra stared at these images of her younger self and felt a crushing weight of recognition. She had spent so many years running from her humble origins that she had forgotten they were part of what made her human. The poverty she had escaped wasn't something shameful to be hidden. It was the foundation of empathy that should have connected her to others who were still struggling. Her parents had died years ago, proud of their daughter's success but worried about the person she was becoming. "Don't forget where you came from, Sandra," her mother had said during one of their last conversations. "Money changes people, but it doesn't have to change who you are inside." Now, sitting alone in her expensive penthouse, surrounded by photos of a life she had tried to erase, Sandra understood that she had failed her mother's final wish. She had let money change not just her circumstances, but her very soul. The truck driver who had saved her life had shown her more genuine kindness than she had shown to anyone in years. The irony was devastating. She had been so afraid that Kyrie would lower her family's status that she had destroyed it herself. She had been so concerned about appearances that she had revealed her true character in the most public way possible. The social standing she had worked decades to achieve had crumbled in a single evening, brought down not by outside forces, but by the ugliness she had allowed to grow within herself. As Sandra sat surrounded by the ghosts of her better self, she began to understand that her real tragedy wasn't losing her social position, it was losing her humanity. The woman who had once been grateful for a stranger's kindness had become someone who would publicly humiliate that same stranger's daughter. The person she had become was someone her younger self would have been ashamed to know. Joshua sat in his mother's penthouse staring out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was spectacular, the kind of panoramic vista that real estate agents described as breathtaking, but all he could see was the reflection of his own shame staring back at him. For 29 years, he had lived his life according to his mother's expectations, making decisions based on what would please her rather than what felt right in his heart. He had chosen his college major based on her business aspirations for him. He had dated women she approved of, joined clubs she thought would advance his social standing, and even chosen his career path to align with her vision of success. But Kyrie had been different. For the first time in his life, Joshua had made a decision purely for himself. He had fallen in love with a woman who worked as a nurse, who drove a modest car, who lived in a small apartment and found joy in simple things. When he was with Kyrie, he felt like he could breathe freely, like he could be himself without constantly measuring his worth against his mother's standards. And now she was gone. The memory of that terrible moment at the wedding played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He could see Kyrie's face as his mother delivered that cruel insult, could remember the way her hand had trembled in his as she waited for him to defend her. He had opened his mouth to speak, had felt the words forming on his tongue, but then he had looked at his mother and hesitated. That hesitation had cost him everything. Joshua had always prided himself on being a good man, but what kind of man lets his wife be publicly humiliated without saying a word? What kind of husband chooses his mother's approval over his wife's dignity? The questions tormented him, and he found himself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything except the magnitude of his failure. But there was something else that bothered him. Something that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness like a persistent itch. The cryptic address and date that Bob Williams had mentioned, mile marker 47, Route 15, March 15th, 1995. What did it mean? The date was the day before his birthday, and his mother's reaction had been so extreme, so visceral, that he knew it had to be significant. After 3 days of internal torture, Joshua finally worked up the courage to ask his mother about it. He found her in her study, surrounded by the old photographs she had been obsessively examining. She looked up when he entered, her face haggard and aged in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I need to know what happened on March 15th, 1995. What did Bob Williams mean by that address? Sandra's face crumpled, and for a moment she seemed to shrink into herself. She looked at her son, this young man she had raised with such fierce determination, and realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. She couldn't hide behind her carefully constructed walls anymore. "Sit down, Joshua," she said, her voice barely audible. He settled into the chair across from her, his heart pounding as he prepared for whatever revelation was coming. Sandra took a shuddering breath and began to speak, her words coming in broken fragments as she relived that terrible night. She told him about the storm, about her car breaking down on the dark highway, about the contractions that had started while she was alone and terrified. She described the truck driver who had appeared like an angel in the darkness, who had driven her to the hospital through dangerous conditions, who had stayed until he knew she was safe. "He saved our lives, Joshua," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Both of us. If he hadn't stopped, if he hadn't helped me, you might never have been born. And I repaid his kindness by insulting his daughter at her wedding." Joshua sat in stunned silence, his hands covering his face as the full weight of the revelation hit him. The man his mother had treated with such disdain, the father of the woman he loved, was the same person who had made his very existence possible. The irony was so cruel, so devastating, that it left him feeling physically ill. When Sandra showed him the old photographs, images of her younger self, humble and grateful and human, Joshua's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Everything he had believed about his family, about their place in society, about who they were and where they came from, was built on a foundation of lies and deliberate forgetting. "But why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you become so cruel to people like him? People like the person you used to be?" Sandra looked at her son through her tears, and for the first time in years she told him the complete truth. Her story poured out like water from a broken dam, the tale of a young woman from poverty who had married into wealth, only to be tormented by a mother-in-law who never let her forget her humble origins. "Your grandmother made my life a living hell," Sandra confessed. "She called me white trash, a gold digger, a peasant who didn't deserve to be part of their family. And your father, he never defended me. Not once. He would sit there in silence while she tore me apart, just like you did with Kyrie." The parallel was so obvious, so painful, that Joshua felt like he had been punched in the stomach. His mother had become the very person who had once tormented her, and he had become his father, weak, passive, unable to stand up for the woman he claimed to love. "I swore I would never let anyone look down on us again," Sandra continued. "I worked so hard to build this life, to create a world where we belonged at the top instead of the bottom. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that being at the top doesn't give you the right to look down on others." Joshua stared at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. She wasn't the powerful, confident businesswoman he had always believed her to be. She was a frightened, wounded woman who had spent decades running from her past, building walls to protect herself from the pain of rejection and shame. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "All of this. Was it worth becoming someone who could hurt innocent people?" Sandra's answer came in the form of broken sobs. She reached for her son, holding him close as she cried for the woman she used to be, for the kindness she had lost, for the relationships she had destroyed in her quest for respectability. For the first time in his adult life, Joshua found himself comforting his mother rather than seeking her approval. As he held her, he realized that she needed redemption as much as he did, maybe more. They had both lost themselves in their pursuit of an image that ultimately meant nothing. "We need to fix this," Joshua said, his voice steady with newfound determination. "We need to make this right." Sandra looked up at him, surprised by the strength in his voice. For a moment, she saw not the compliant son she had raised, but a man who was finally ready to make his own decisions. "Yes," she whispered. "We do." The drive to Bob Williams' farm took them through countryside that neither of them had paid attention to in years. Sandra had insisted on taking her modest sedan rather than the luxury car she usually drove, and she had dressed in simple clothes. A plain blouse and slacks that made her look more like the young woman in the old photographs than the corporate executive she had become. The farm was exactly what Joshua had expected, neat and well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that spoke of love and care rather than money and status. This was the house his father-in-law had built with his own hands, the home he had planned to give to Joshua and Kyrie as a wedding gift. Bob Williams emerged from the house as they pulled up, his weathered face showing no surprise at their arrival. He had probably been expecting this visit, Joshua realized. The man was too wise not to know that the conversation begun at the wedding would need to be finished. "Well, well," Bob said, his tone carrying just enough sarcasm to make his point. "Look what the cat dragged in. Come to slum it with us peasants." Sandra flinched at the words, but she didn't respond with anger. Instead, she stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent. "Mr. Williams," she said quietly, "we're here to apologize." Bob's expression didn't change. "You can apologize all you want, Mrs. Morrison. Doesn't change what you did. And it doesn't change the fact that my daughter is in there crying her eyes out over a man who didn't have the backbone to stand up for her." The words hit Joshua like physical blows, but he forced himself to meet Bob's gaze. "You're right," he said. "I failed her. I failed as a husband, and I failed as a man. But I want you to know that I'm here to thank you." Bob raised an eyebrow. "Thank me? For what?" "For saving my mother's life. For saving my life. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have had the chance to meet your daughter, to fall in love with her, to experience the happiest moments of my life." Joshua took a step forward, his voice growing stronger. "I love Kyrie more than I've ever loved anyone or anything in my life. She's the only good decision I ever made completely on my own, without worrying about what anyone else would think. And I let her down when she needed me most." He turned to look at his mother, who stood with tears streaming down her face. "We both did. But if you'll let us, we want to make it right. We want to earn the right to be part of your family." Sandra stepped forward, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Bob, I need you to know that after Joshua was born, I should have looked for you. I should have found a way to thank you properly for what you did. But I was so caught up in my new life, so focused on fitting in with my husband's family, that I let myself forget." Her tears came harder now, years of suppressed guilt and shame finally finding their release. "I forgot the most important thing that ever happened to me. I forgot that when I was desperate and scared, a good man helped me without asking for anything in return. I forgot that kindness exists in this world, and I let myself become someone who couldn't recognize it when I saw it again." Bob stood silently, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Joshua could see movement in the house, a curtain twitching, a shadow passing by a window. Kyrie was there, listening, waiting to see what would happen next. "I don't know if you can forgive me," Sandra continued. "I don't know if I deserve it, but I want you to know that I remember now. I remember who I used to be, and I want to try to be that person again." Joshua looked at the house, at the windows where he hoped his wife might be watching. "I want to learn how to be the man Kyrie deserves. I want to learn how to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right, not just what's easy. And I think I need to learn that from you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of past mistakes and future possibilities. Bob Williams studied the two people standing before him, the woman who had once been grateful for his help, and the man who had married his daughter, and saw something he hadn't expected to see. He saw the possibility of redemption. "Well," Bob said finally, his voice softer than it had been. "I suppose we all make mistakes. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them." He turned toward the house, and Joshua's heart leaped as he saw Kyrie appear in the doorway. She looked uncertain, hurt, but not hopeless. Her eyes met his across the yard, and for the first time since the wedding, Joshua saw something other than disappointment in her gaze. "Come on inside," Bob said, gesturing toward the porch. "We've got some talking to do." As they walked toward the house together, Sandra, Joshua, and Bob, Joshua felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his life, he was walking toward something he had chosen for himself, something that mattered more than status or approval or the expectations of others. He was walking toward the possibility of becoming the man he was meant to be, the husband Kyrie deserved, and the son who could finally make his mother proud of the person he had become rather than the image he had projected. The road to redemption would be long and difficult, but as Joshua saw Kyrie waiting for him on the porch of the house her father had built with love, he knew it was a journey worth taking.